So, here's the deal. I run a small chain of stores, and one of my managers, let's call her Claire, has been with me for years. Claire's one of those people who just gets it. She's sharp, always friendly, and handles tough situations like a pro. But recently, she's been dealing with a situation that's, well, honestly, it's been pretty surreal. This guy, we'll call him Steve, started coming into the store a few weeks ago. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. He'd browse, buy a few things, chat a little. Claire would give him the usual customer service, smile, answer questions. But then, things started to shift. Steve started coming in more frequently. Like, way more frequently. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And it wasn't just about the products anymore, it was all about Claire. At first, it was annoying but manageable. But soon, it got weird. He started to act like everything in the store was handpicked just for him, like it was this deep connection he had with Claire's choices. I get it, the stuff we sell is pretty niche, but there's no way a stranger could be that invested unless there's something else going on. That's when I started getting concerned. Claire wasn't saying much, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. You know that look people get when they're trying to be polite, but it's obvious they're not feeling safe or at ease? Yeah, she had that. And that's when I started to realize, this wasn't just a weird customer situation, this was something more. It didn't take long before the warning signs started popping up. Steve wasn't just buying things anymore, he was starting to follow Claire's shifts. I don't think she noticed at first, but I did. I mean, the guy would show up at exactly the same time each day. It wasn't like he was just casually popping in either. He'd always hang around, chatting her up for way too long, often after his purchase was long finished. At first, Claire was too nice to push him away. She's always been polite, but this was starting to get uncomfortable for everyone. I noticed her getting more distracted, her smile feeling a little forced. And when I asked her about it, she brushed it off like it was no big deal. But I could tell something was off. Then, one day, I overheard Steve telling Claire that he just knew they'd have everything in common. I couldn't help but laugh inside, like, this guy had never even talked to Claire about anything personal. He was basing everything on the fact that he liked the products she'd chosen for the store. Seriously? It was so bizarre, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just a harmless, albeit obsessive, customer. That was until he started showing up with gifts. Little things, nothing too crazy, some flowers, a book he thought Claire would like, a keychain from a trip he'd taken. It was subtle at first, but it was starting to feel like he was making the store about him rather than just shopping. I was starting to get a bad feeling, but Claire kept telling me it was fine. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Things took a turn for the worse when Steve started showing up at the store when Claire wasn't even working. I'll be honest, I didn't notice at first because I wasn't always there during every shift. But one day, I was working a late shift and Steve came in. He had that weird, over-enthusiastic smile on his face, and he started asking if Claire would be coming in soon. When I told him she was off for the day, his demeanor shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. He lingered around the store longer than usual, pacing in front of the section where Claire would usually be. He even asked if I could tell him what time she was coming in the next day. At that point, I knew it was no longer about the products, this was about her. I decided to take it a step further. I mentioned to Claire that Steve had been asking about her schedule. She shrugged it off and said he was just a dedicated customer. But I could tell it bothered her more than she was letting on. And then, when I checked the store's security footage later that week, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Steve had been hanging around outside the store after hours, just standing there, staring inside. He wasn't even making any attempt to hide it. He was clearly watching the store, waiting for her to come back. It was like a scene straight out of some creepy movie, and I didn't know how to handle it. This was no longer just some weird customer, it was something more sinister. Something obsessive. I could see it on Claire's face now, her usual confidence was starting to crack. She'd show up for her shifts with a forced smile, but I could tell she was mentally exhausted. Every time Steve walked in, she'd get this tight, uncomfortable look on her face. And it wasn't just him anymore, other customers were noticing, too. You know how it is when one weird thing starts happening, and then it feels like the whole atmosphere shifts? The vibe in the store was starting to feel off. I decided to have a serious talk with her. I pulled her aside one afternoon after the store closed. She looked drained, eyes a little puffy like she'd been losing sleep over it. I told her, "You don't have to deal with this alone, Claire. If you want, we can figure something out." She hesitated. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was trying to hide just how uncomfortable she'd become. But then, she sighed and confessed, "He's not just following me around, it's like he's, I don't know, stalking me. He even asked if I wanted to go out for coffee after work the other day." I said no, but he didn't seem to take it seriously. I could feel the weight of it. This wasn't some random customer anymore, it was a pattern. I hated that she had to deal with this. But I knew it was time to put a stop to it. So, we came up with a plan. I would talk to Steve directly, let him know that his behavior wasn't okay and that he'd have to stop coming into the store. Simple, right? At least, that's what I thought at the time. But I had no idea how far things had already gone or how crazy things were about to get. The next time Steve came in, I made sure I was there. I'd been gearing up for this moment, mentally preparing myself for the conversation that I knew was going to be uncomfortable, but necessary. When he walked through the door, I greeted him, trying to keep things casual. He looked at me like he didn't even notice the tension in the air. "Hey, Steve," I said, trying to sound friendly but firm. "Can we have a quick word?" He gave me that smile again, the one that made my skin crawl. "Sure, man. What's up?" he said, casually leaning against one of the shelves. I led him toward the back of the store, away from the few other customers. "Look, Steve," I started, trying to keep my tone calm, "I've noticed you've been coming in a lot lately, and you've been asking about Claire's schedule and following her around. It's making her uncomfortable. So, I just need to tell you, it's not okay." His face froze for a second, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't going to back down easily. But instead of apologizing, like I expected, he actually seemed surprised, like I was the one overreacting. "What? I'm just a regular customer, man," he said, a bit defensive. "I'm just trying to connect. You know, I get the vibe from Claire. She's into the same things I am. We're like kindred spirits, right? I thought she'd appreciate the company." I shook my head, trying to stay composed. "Steve, it's not like that. She's told you no multiple times, and you're still pushing it. This isn't just about shared interests, it's about boundaries. You need to respect them." He looked at me for a long moment, and for a split second, I thought maybe he was finally going to understand. But then he laughed, shaking his head. "You just don't get it, do you? I'm not going anywhere. I'll just keep coming back. She and I are meant to be, you'll see." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Meant to be? This guy was completely delusional. It was clear he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Steve. And if you come back, I'll be forced to take further action." He stood there for a moment, staring me down, before a twisted smile crept across his face. "You'll regret this. We'll see what happens next." It was then that I realized this wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about control. The next day, we had a problem. A big one. I was in the office when one of the staff members came to find me. There's someone outside," they said, looking uneasy. "It's Steve. He's just standing out there, staring at the door." I immediately felt my stomach drop. The guy hadn't just left after our conversation, he was now waiting outside. Watching the store. Watching Claire. This was escalating quickly, and I wasn't sure what to do next. I walked outside to confront him again, but this time, he didn't even acknowledge me. He just stared right past me, his eyes glued to the door. I could tell he was obsessed, caught in this delusional fantasy where everything he wanted was just one more step away. This wasn't the quirky, harmless guy who liked the same niche products as Claire anymore. This was someone dangerous, someone who refused to accept reality. I took a deep breath and said, "Steve, this has to stop. You're banned from the store. I'm serious. If you come back, we're involving the authorities." His eyes snapped to mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Anger? Disbelief? Maybe both. He stood there for a few seconds, silent, before finally speaking. "You think you can keep me away from her?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You don't understand. I'm the only one who really sees her for who she is. She'll come around. You'll see." I could feel my blood boil at that. But I didn't want to give him more fuel to keep going. "No, Steve. You're not welcome here. You're crossing a line." At that point, I knew I had to take it further legally, if necessary. I went back inside and told Claire what had happened, and she was visibly shaken. It wasn't just about Steve anymore. It was about her feeling safe in a place she'd always felt comfortable. We called the authorities, and Steve was officially banned from the premises. He was given a warning, but I had a bad feeling that this wouldn't be the last time we saw him. It didn't feel like a win. It felt like the first step in a much bigger battle. But it was a battle we couldn't afford to lose. Not for Claire, and not for anyone else who might become his next target. After Steve was banned, I honestly thought that would be the end of it. But nope. That's when things really started getting out of hand. A few days after the ban, Claire came to me looking even more distressed than usual. "He's sending me messages," she said quietly, barely able to meet my eyes. "He's been emailing, texting, even sending DMs on social media. He says I'm not the person I pretend to be, that I've been lying to him." I felt a cold rush of anger hit me. This guy had crossed every boundary we'd set, and now he was invading Claire's personal space. What was worse, she hadn't even told me about the messages at first. She was too worried about making things worse. But this wasn't just a couple of harmless texts anymore. Steve had turned into a full-on stalker, using every form of communication he could think of to reach her. The messages ranged from borderline sweet, like "I know we're meant to be," to outright scary, such as "I'll be waiting for the day you see the truth." It wasn't long before Claire started getting more than just digital messages. One morning, she came in holding a package wrapped in plain brown paper, but with a note that read, "You can't escape what's meant to be." I immediately called the authorities again. At this point, I realized that the situation was far from over, and I was starting to feel like we were in some kind of nightmare we couldn't wake up from. They said they'd look into it, but honestly, I wasn't sure how much they could do without him doing something illegal. And then came the real kicker: Steve started showing up at the store again. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just waiting outside. He was sitting on the curb across the street, watching the store. 4 hours. Day after day. Claire started becoming more paranoid. She wouldn't go out for lunch by herself anymore, wouldn't even walk to her car without looking over her shoulder. It wasn't just affecting her work anymore, it was invading her whole life. And that killed me inside, because this was our business, and I couldn't even protect her from one obsessive creep. I was running out of options. Steve wasn't backing down, and at this point, I wasn't sure who would. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the twist came. One day, Steve didn't show up. At first, I thought maybe he'd gotten the hint, finally taken the warning seriously. Maybe he realized his behavior was completely out of line. I don't know why I thought that, because nothing had been simple about this situation from the start. But then, things started getting strange. Claire got another gift. This time, it was a book, wrapped neatly in red paper with a little card attached. The card read, "You'll understand soon. Everything is already planned." I could see her trying to hold it together, but I could tell this last gesture unnerved her. She handed it to me, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." And then, the real shock hit. The following day, I found out Steve was gone. No longer sitting across the street, no more weird gifts, no more messages. It was like he had just disappeared off the face of the earth. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally been scared off. But then, the reports started coming in. One of our other store managers called me, saying a man matching Steve's description had been seen entering a building a few blocks away, a building that was currently under construction. It seemed strange, but it was enough to get my attention. And that's when things started to click. I went to check it out. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something wasn't right. When I arrived, the place looked abandoned. There was construction equipment scattered around, but no workers. I walked around the perimeter, peering through the chain-link fence. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the lot was a small, makeshift shack. And standing next to it, almost blending into the shadows, was Steve. He didn't see me at first, but the moment he turned his head and locked eyes with me, a chill ran down my spine. He didn't look scared or apologetic. No, he looked determined. He took a step forward, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You don't understand. I'll never let her go. She belongs with me." That's when I realized this had gone beyond some creepy obsession. Steve had crossed into something much darker. And now, he was ready to make sure Claire knew it. I couldn't just stand there and let him continue spiraling. This wasn't just some messed up crush anymore, it was a full-blown fixation. And now, he was willing to go to extreme lengths to make sure Claire was his. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't let this go any further. I couldn't let him hurt Claire, and I couldn't let this situation spiral out of control. It was time to confront him head-on again. "Steve," I called out, stepping toward him. He didn't move, but he kept his eyes on me, almost as if he were daring me to come closer. "This has to stop now. You're crossing lines that can't be uncrossed." He smirked, a creepy, almost manic expression crossing his face. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "You're just a bystander in this story. Claire and I were meant to be. You can't stop that." I took another step forward, my heart pounding. "Steve, this is not love. What you're doing is manipulation. It's obsession. And it needs to end." For a moment, there was silence. He just stood there, staring at me like he was weighing his options. And then, just as quickly, his demeanor shifted. It was like a switch flipped inside his head, and the rage came flooding in. "You're in the way," he snarled, his fists clenching. "You think you can just tell me what to do? You think you can just protect her from me?" I didn't back down. "I'm not trying to protect her from you, Steve, I'm trying to protect her from herself," I said, my voice steady. "You're hurting her. And you need to leave before this gets any worse." He took a step toward me, his expression wild. "I'll make you regret this," he spat, then turned and walked toward the shack. But before I could react, he stopped in his tracks, turning his head back to look at me over his shoulder. "You'll see," he said quietly. "You'll all see. This isn't over." I stood there for a few moments, my body tense, watching him disappear into the shadows of the abandoned lot. My mind was racing. This wasn't just a random act of obsession anymore, this was a warning. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with someone who was getting ready to escalate things even further. I had to act fast. For a brief moment, after Steve disappeared into the shadows, I thought we might be in the clear. The adrenaline from our confrontation was still pumping through my veins, but I tried to convince myself that this might have been the turning point. Maybe he'd finally gotten the message, realized that we weren't going to let him manipulate or scare us. But deep down, I knew better. There was no way this was over. Steve wasn't the kind of guy to just back off. He was obsessed, and obsession doesn't just disappear. The next few days were oddly quiet. Steve didn't show up at the store. No weird messages. No gifts. Nothing. I tried to keep myself from getting too comfortable, but the silence felt unnatural. I kept telling myself that something was coming, and I had no idea what it was, but I wasn't prepared for the bombshell that dropped on us. It was a regular afternoon, just like any other, and Claire had just finished her shift. We were standing outside talking, and I was giving her a little pep talk about how things had settled down a bit until we heard it. A loud, shrill noise echoed through the street. At first, I didn't understand what it was. It almost sounded like an alarm, but it was louder, more insistent. I turned around, my heart dropping into my stomach, and saw it, Steve's car. A rusty, old sedan that had been parked down the street for the last few days, now racing toward the store. But it wasn't just driving by, it was heading straight for us. Before I could react, Steve slammed the brakes and threw open the door, stepping out in a rush. His face was twisted in fury, his eyes wild. "You think you can just keep me away?" he screamed, voice hoarse with rage. "I'll show you who's in control here." My instinct kicked in. I grabbed Claire by the arm, pulling her behind me, but I didn't have much time to think. Steve was now standing in front of us, blocking the sidewalk, and his hands were shaking. The look in his eyes was pure, unfiltered madness. I could hear Claire's breath quicken behind me, and I knew she was terrified. But I wasn't going to let him get any closer. "Steve, stop!" I shouted. "You need to leave. Now." But he wasn't listening. He stepped forward, eyes locked on Claire. "You're mine," he muttered under his breath, like some twisted mantra. "You can't get away from me." I could feel the tension thickening in the air. The way he was acting, the crazed look in his eyes, it was clear he wasn't leaving without making a scene, and I had no idea how far he was willing to go. That's when I heard it. A loud, blaring horn. Someone else had pulled up behind us. Another car, and another person was stepping out. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I saw the second car pull up. It screeched to a halt, and for a split second, I was too stunned to move. Who the hell was this? But then, a figure stepped out of the car, and I recognized them immediately. It was Ryan, one of our regulars who had been coming to the store for years. Ryan wasn't just a customer. He'd become a friend of sorts, always friendly, always looking out for Claire and me. He was built like a linebacker, but had this easygoing demeanor that made him easy to trust. If there was anyone who could defuse this situation, it was him. Steve froze for a moment when he saw Ryan, his gaze flickering between us. The madness in his eyes flickered, just for a second, like he realized he wasn't alone in this. Ryan was already stepping toward us, his posture calm but firm. "Steve, you need to back off," he said in that deep, gravelly voice of his. He wasn't yelling, he was just there. His presence alone was enough to make Steve pause. Steve took a half step back, but his face twisted in anger. "This is none of your business," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "She's my business." Ryan didn't flinch. He kept his focus on Steve, his voice steady. "It's everyone's business when someone's acting like this. Now, get in your car and leave before this gets worse for you." I could see Steve's hands clenching into fists, his face reddening, and I knew he wasn't backing down easily. But Ryan wasn't having any of it. He wasn't moving, and the tension between them was palpable. There was a long, terrifying silence. Steve looked between Ryan and me, his mind clearly racing. I could see the way his confidence was cracking. He didn't know if he could take on both of us, but I also knew he wasn't thinking rationally. Ryan took another step forward. "This is your last chance, Steve," he said quietly, but there was something in his voice that left no room for doubt. "Leave now, and you won't have to worry about any of this again." Steve took a long look at both of us, his breathing ragged. And then, just like that, the moment passed. He turned, slammed the door of his car, and sped off down the street. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. I was breathing hard, my heart racing. But before I could say anything, Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Is he really gone?" I nodded, my throat tight. "For now." Ryan came over and put a hand on my shoulder, giving me a small, reassuring smile. "You're good, man. I've got your back." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We weren't alone in this. But at the same time, I knew it wasn't over. Steve was still out there, and I wasn't sure what he was going to do next. But for the first time in days, I felt like maybe we had a fighting chance. After the encounter with Steve, things seemed to calm down for a while, but the sense of unease lingered. I had to remind myself that this wasn't over. Steve wasn't going to just disappear, not after everything. He was obsessed, and that obsession wasn't going to just fade away with a simple confrontation. But the store returned to a normal rhythm. Claire was more on edge than usual, but she was doing her best to keep things together. Ryan checked in with us regularly, offering support and even hanging around the store during busy hours just to make sure Steve didn't show up. It felt like we were in a lull, the calm before the storm. Everyone was trying to keep their guard up, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Steve had finally gotten the message. But then, one morning, everything changed. I was behind the counter, checking stock, when the door swung open. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but instead, I saw a familiar face: Steve. He was standing there, staring at me with that same unsettling grin he'd had the day he threatened me outside the shack. This time, though, there was something different about him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even acting aggressive. He looked calm. Too calm. My heart dropped, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. He was back. And he wasn't looking for a confrontation, at least, not the way I expected. I took a cautious step forward. "Steve, what are you doing here?" I said, my voice steady but my nerves on edge. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he just walked slowly toward me, his eyes fixed on mine. "I told you, you'd regret trying to keep me away from her," he said, his voice soft, almost too quiet. My mind raced. Was this it? Was he about to snap again? Was this going to escalate into something worse? But then, without warning, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but then I realized it was a phone. He tossed it onto the counter between us. "You'll need this," he said, his smile widening just slightly. "You can keep it, but you'll have to watch it every day. See the truth for yourself." I picked up the phone slowly, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. Inside, there were dozens of photos of Claire, photos taken from across the street, from alleyways, from cars parked around the block. Photos of her at work, walking to her car, sitting at the coffee shop. It was terrifying. He'd been following her, tracking her every move. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the video that came up next. It was a recording of Claire, no, of us, talking in the store. She was talking to a customer, laughing. It was so innocent. But the way Steve narrated the video, the way he spoke over it, it was chilling. "This is where she belongs," his voice whispered over the video, his words almost reverent. "This is her life now. She's mine. She doesn't know it yet, but she will." I felt a cold fury rise inside me. This was it. This was the moment I'd feared. Steve had crossed a line, no longer just obsessed with Claire, but now trying to manipulate the narrative, trying to twist reality into something it wasn't. I looked up at Steve, my breath ragged. "You need to get out," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You've crossed every line. You're done." He smiled again, that same airy smile, and turned to leave. But before he walked out the door, he said something that sent a chill straight to my bones. "You'll see, eventually. She'll come around. You can't stop it." And then he was gone. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, my mind spinning. I didn't know how to stop this. I didn't know how to protect Claire from someone who was this far gone. But one thing was clear, things were only getting worse. And now, I was the one who needed to figure out how to stop Steve before he destroyed everything. It didn't take long for the full weight of Steve's actions to sink in. The photos, the video, the message, it was all too much. I couldn't just sit by anymore, hoping things would get better. This wasn't some temporary phase he was going through. This was a full-blown obsession, and it was consuming him. And now, it was consuming us, too. I could tell Claire was terrified. She was trying to hold it together, like she had been from the start, but every time she looked at that phone, it was like she was seeing the entire world unravel around her. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let Steve win. I took the phone to the police the next morning. I needed to make this official. If he was going to keep up this harassment, if he was going to escalate things further, I needed evidence, and I needed a legal course of action. The officers were sympathetic, but I could tell they didn't take me as seriously as I wanted them to. They said they'd look into it, but I didn't feel any real sense of urgency from them. I wasn't about to wait around for the police to figure it out. I knew it was up to me to stop Steve before he took things even further. I met with Ryan later that day. I told him everything about the phone, the photos, the video, everything. His face went from concern to downright pissed when he saw the footage. "You're right," Ryan said after a long silence, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't just creepy anymore. This is dangerous. I don't care what it takes, we're going to put an end to this." Ryan wasn't just talking about calling the cops or getting a restraining order. He was talking about action. And while I wasn't entirely sure how far he was willing to go, I could tell this wasn't a suggestion, it was a plan. He was done sitting around, hoping Steve would stop. I didn't know if I was ready for things to escalate any further, but one thing was certain: if we were going to stop Steve, it was going to take more than just legal threats and hoping he'd get the message. This wasn't something that could be handled passively. I turned to Claire that night. "I'm not letting him win. Not like this," I told her, my voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't know how much more I can take." I understood. We were at a breaking point. And the worst part was that I didn't know if there was a clean way out. I didn't know how we could stop Steve without it turning into something even uglier. But I had to find a way. Because if I didn't, Steve was going to destroy everything we'd built, everything Claire had worked so hard for. And that was something I couldn't allow. The next day, I made some calls. I wasn't going to just sit back anymore. I wasn't going to wait for Steve to make the first move. It was time to take control of the situation before it spiraled even further. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: it was going to get ugly before it got better. And I had to be ready. The following days felt like an emotional roller coaster. There were moments when I thought we had everything under control, when I thought maybe we could avoid any more escalation, and then there were moments where I felt like I was losing my mind. Steve's shadow loomed over every decision, every action we took. And the worst part was, he wasn't just some random threat anymore. He had become a part of our daily lives. I couldn't get the images out of my head, the photos of Claire, the video, Steve's chilling words. "She's mine. You can't stop it." Those words echoed in my thoughts like a constant reminder of what we were up against. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became: Steve was no longer someone we could ignore. He was a real threat now, and I wasn't going to let him take anything else from us. Ryan had come through. He had contacts, people who weren't afraid to go above and beyond the law if necessary. I wasn't sure if I was comfortable with some of the methods he suggested, but I had to admit, his connections had power. Power that might be able to end this nightmare before it got worse. But there was a line I wasn't sure I was willing to cross. I kept thinking about Claire, about how much she had already endured. I wanted to protect her, but I didn't want her to end up feeling like we'd crossed a line that we couldn't uncross. So I made a decision. It wasn't one I made lightly, and it wasn't one I made alone. I sat down with Claire, Ryan, and a few of the other people we trusted. We needed a plan, one that didn't involve us playing into Steve's sick game. We needed something that would stop him without giving him the satisfaction of pushing us over the edge. "We go to the authorities," I said, my voice steady but determined. "We push for a restraining order. We make it official. And if that doesn't work, we have to be prepared to escalate, but we do it carefully. We need to make sure we have everything documented. Claire nodded slowly, her eyes tired but resolute. I don't want anyone to get hurt. But I'm done living in fear. Ryan crossed his arms, his expression serious. I agree. I'm not about to let him keep this up either. But we have to make sure we're ready for anything. If he doesn't stop with the restraining order, we'll have to take it further. No more running. I could see the tension in Claire's face as she looked between the two of us. I knew this wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself. But right then, it didn't matter what she had imagined. What mattered was that we couldn't back down. We couldn't let Steve control us any longer. We all agreed on the plan, and I felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least now we had a direction. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were taking control of our own lives. That night, I sat alone for a while, thinking it all through. I'd never imagined my life would end up like this, caught in a twisted game of obsession, fear, and anger. But as I thought about what was at stake, what Steve had already taken from us, I knew that I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let fear rule us. Tomorrow, I'd take the first step. I'd go back to the police, file the report, and make sure everything was on record. But I also knew that even with the authorities involved, we had to be prepared for what came next. Steve wasn't just going to roll over. And neither were we. It was time to end this once and for all. The day I filed the report was one of the hardest days I've ever faced. As I walked into the police station, clutching the evidence Steve had given me, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything on my shoulders. It wasn't just paperwork. It wasn't just a report. It was the first real step in confronting the monster that had been lurking in the shadows for so long. I handed over the photos, the video, everything. I could see the officers taking it seriously this time, especially after I emphasized the escalation in Steve's behavior. This wasn't some harmless crush. This was a man on the edge, and I was terrified of what might happen next if we didn't do something now. The officers assured me that they'd put out an official restraining order, but I could tell they were already preparing for the worst. Steve was dangerous, and they knew it. As they gathered the paperwork and started their investigation, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. We had taken the right step, but the storm was far from over. I returned to the store that afternoon, my mind still spinning. Claire was there, sitting behind the counter, her face pale but determined. She didn't say anything at first, but when she saw me walk in, she stood up. "How did it go?" she asked quietly, as if she already knew the answer. "We're moving forward," I said, my voice steady. "The restraining order will be in place. They'll track him down, and we're getting everything on record." Her eyes searched mine, but I could see the relief flickering there, despite the fear still present in her gaze. "You're sure this will work?" "I'm sure we'll make it work," I said, walking over to her. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "But we can't let our guard down. We've come this far, but we're not done yet." Over the next few weeks, there were moments where I started to feel like maybe Steve really was gone. The store was quieter. There were no more strange cars parked outside. No late-night messages. It almost felt like we were finally getting our lives back. But then, one morning, as I opened the store, something caught my eye. A small envelope was sitting on the counter. I frowned, walking over to it, and opened it carefully. Inside, there was a single note. "You can't run forever." It was written in the same shaky handwriting Steve had used in his previous notes. And though it was just a note, something in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't over yet. But as I looked at Claire, who was standing behind the counter, her face uncertain but strong, I knew we weren't going to back down this time. Steve could try to break us, but we had each other, and that was all we needed to stay strong. We weren't afraid anymore. And we weren't going to let him control our lives. I walked over to Claire and took her hand. "We'll deal with this together," I said, my voice firm, unwavering. "And when it's over, we'll be free. This is our life, and we're not letting anyone take it from us." She nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension. "Together," she whispered. And I knew, with all the chaos and fear we'd been through, that we were going to be okay. Not because everything was solved, but because we had each other, and that was more than enough to face whatever came next. The end.